Okay, so on October 3rd, 2020, a typical Saturday evening there in Lower Providence Township, Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, a call came into the 911 emergency dispatch service. And honestly, it's one of those calls that local law enforcement will never forget. I mean, it was just chilling. The voice on the other end, though, it wasn't screaming. There was no panic, no hysteria, no plea for help, not like you usually hear on those kinds of calls. No, this was just calm, really measured, almost mechanically detached. The caller, 29-year-old Austin Stevens, he just reported that his 10-month-old daughter, Zara Lynn Scruggs, wasn't breathing. When the paramedics got to the address, that's 3400 Germantown Pike, it was just an oppressive scene. The apartment was practically empty, Not just no furniture, but no basic stuff either. No heating, no electricity, no hot running water. The temperature inside, they'd record it later, was barely reaching 15 degrees Celsius. Now, a first look, it didn't show any obvious injuries and her diaper was clean, but the whole thing, it just set off this sharp sense of alarm and bewilderment in those experienced medics. The story her father told them, it just completely contradicted what they were seeing, the physical evidence. And while the medics were just desperately fighting for Zara's life, using every resuscitation measure they possibly could, Austin Stevens just stood off to the side. There were no tears, no horror on his face. He just silently, with this frightening calmness, watched what was happening. Like the outcome of this whole struggle was already known to him, predetermined. Look, this isn't a story about some tragic accident or even just criminal negligence in the usual sense. It's more a documentary chronicle, really, of how this whole facade of well-being and normalcy can hide something just unimaginable. And how, honestly, blind trust, just based on habit and what things look like, can lead to complete disaster. It's a story about how the most terrible stuff can happen in this complete deafening silence, totally unnoticed by everyone around, until it's just too late. Zara Lynn Scruggs, she was born on December 1st, 2019, and she was a long-awaited, totally beloved child. Her mother, Erica Scruggs, she was just completely devoted to her. Within the family, they lovingly called Zara Moo, just a nickname that stuck, for no real reason, just out of love. Erica was that kind of mom who documented every moment of her child's life. Zara was just energetic, expressive. Her wide smile and big eyes, they charmed everyone. Erica's albums and phone, they were just full of photos and videos. Here's Zara taking her first steps, holding onto furniture. Here she is dancing to music, which she really loved. Zara's father, Austin Stevens, at first glance, honestly, he seemed like the complete opposite of someone who could ever harm his own child. At 29 years old, he gave off this impression of being successful, responsible, really accomplished. He was the assistant coach for the local youth football team, the Lower Providence Warriors, and he was a co-owner of a construction company called Black Diamond Construction. His appearance, always neat, well-groomed. His speech, articulate, confident. He just had this professional facade that didn't raise any suspicions whatsoever. And his past, no dark spots. No problems with the law, no complaints from clients or anyone he knew, not a single signal that could have hinted at any potential danger. Now, Erica and Austin's relationship hadn't worked out, so they decided to separate. But they did agree on joint custody of Zara, choosing not to go through official court proceedings. It was just a verbal, informal agreement based on their shared past, and it seemed on mutual respect and their love for their daughter. Zara usually lived with her mom and Erica's parents, who really helped out with raising their granddaughter, but she regularly went to stay with her dad, usually on weekends. And this whole system just worked. No glitches, no conflicts. Erica's family, they never had any reason to worry. Zara's grandfather, when he'd hand his granddaughter over to Austin, he'd often just exchange a friendly handshake with him. In their eyes, Austin was just a reliable co-parent. Shortly before everything happened, on October 1st, 2020, Austin moved into a new apartment. It was still unfurnished. And he mentioned just in passing to Erica and her parents that some utilities weren't connected yet, including the heating and hot water. No one really gave it much thought. I mean, temporary domestic difficulties during a move, that's pretty common, and it just didn't set off any alarm bells. So, on that fateful evening, October 3rd, Austin, like he had so many times before, came to pick up Zara. The visit was completely routine. No changes in his behavior, no tension in their communication. In the minds of Erica and her parents, it was just another standard handover of a child from one loving parent to another. And in that atmosphere of normalcy and complete trust, there was just no room for questions that, as we'd find out later, were just vitally necessary to ask. What actually happened inside that cold, half-empty apartment on Germantown Pike? Well, the investigation figured it out thanks to a silent witness, Austin Stevens' mobile phone. The digital trail he left that night, man, it allowed for this chillingly precise reconstruction of the whole timeline, and it showed the shocking duality of his behavior in Zara's last hours. A Saturday evening for a 10-month-old child really should have been spent in warmth and care. Instead, Zara was in a room that was 15 degrees Celsius. What exactly caused her condition to get worse, the investigation would determine later, but her father's reaction was recorded minute by minute. Between 9:27 p.m. and 10:22 p.m., Austin's phone was active, and an analysis of his browser search history, it paints this picture of a developing catastrophe. The queries he typed in, one after another, these queries, they were a cry for help that just never left his lips. But here's the most horrifying part of this whole thing. What was happening on his phone screen at the same time? In the very same minutes he was searching for life-saving information, he was actively corresponding on social media with two different women. The content of those dialogues, which investigators got later with a warrant, it just contrasted so sharply with the tragedy unfolding right next to him. They were light, flirtatious conversations that had absolutely nothing to do with his daughter. He sent the women photos of himself. They exchanged compliments, just carried on a casual conversation. In one browser tab, he was a father whose child was on the brink of life and death, and in another, just a carefree man looking for female attention. Honestly, it wasn't until 10:40 p.m., more than an hour after he'd started his first alarming search, that Austin Stevens even dialed 911. And he told the dispatcher this story that he had obviously pre-prepared, and it was just totally false. He claimed that he was giving Zara a bath, but that he just stepped out for a second to the kitchen to grab a beer. And at that point, he supposedly heard this thud, and he just assumed his daughter had hit herself on the bathtub. He said he went back in and found her unconscious, so he pulled her out, wrapped her in a towel, and tried to revive her. But when the paramedics burst into the apartment, they immediately knew his story was a total fabrication. The bathtub was bone dry, not a drop of water, no damp towels, not the slightest sign that anyone had recently been bathed there. Zara, dressed only in a diaper, was just lying there on the mattress. But the most alarming thing for these medics who, they're used to the panic and the grief of parents in these kinds of situations, was Austin's behavior. He was calm. Not just calm, but completely detached. When one of the paramedics, in a hurry, asked him to hand him something from the medical bag, Stevens just shrugged and handed him the wrong item, not even trying to correct his mistake. He just stood there and watched. That hour of delay, an hour where a child's life could have been saved, that became the central part of the prosecution's case. What the hell was Austin doing during all that time? Why did he wait? And how can a person, simultaneously Google how to save a baby and also flirt with women? I mean, the answers to those questions would paint a portrait of a criminal whose cold-bloodedness just stunned even seasoned detectives. At 12 minutes past midnight on October 4th, 2020, at the medical center where Zara had been brought in critical condition, the doctors were just forced to pronounce her dead. Despite everything they tried, the little girl just couldn't be saved. From that moment on, the case went from being a medical matter to a criminal one. Austin Stevens' version of an accidental fall in the bathtub was completely and definitively refuted by the medical facts. At the same time, investigators got a warrant for full access to the data on Stevens' phone. And what they found, you guys, it became irrefutable proof of his guilt and the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. The timestamps of the search queries, cross-referenced with his social media activity, created this minute-by-minute reconstruction of his actions. It became clear that Stevens hadn't just delayed calling for help, he had made a conscious decision not to, preferring to spend those precious minutes on, personal entertainment while his daughter was just fading away. The analysis of other evidence they found in the apartment, including the diaper, also came back with stuff that just contradicted his whole testimony. After gathering enough evidence, on October 6th, 2020, just 2 days after Zara's death, detectives arrested Austin Stevens. He was initially charged with aggravated assault and endangering the welfare of a child, and the prosecution immediately moved to hold him without bail. On December 1st, 2020, the day Zara would have turned, 1-year-old Montgomery County District Attorney Kevin R. Steele announced that after getting all the forensic results, the charges had been upgraded. Stevens was now charged with first and third-degree murder, as well as other related criminal offenses. The news of the arrest and the horrifying details of the case just rocked the local community. People who knew Stevens as a friendly coach and a respectable businessman were just in total shock. The image he had so carefully put together shattered in an instant, exposing this monstrous reality. One of the most powerful and telling moments was the public reaction of his own mother. In her statement to the media, she didn't try to justify her son or ask for leniency. Her words were just full of pain and this complete condemnation. She said he was a monster, that they were not supporting him at all, that they were 100% against what he did to her granddaughter, and that they loved Zara very much. This unequivocal stance, choosing the murdered child over her own son, was just this rare display of moral clarity in this really grim story. While the legal machine started to pick up speed, the community just rallied to support Zara's grief-stricken mother, Erica, and her family. A fundraiser was organized on GoFundMe in memory of the girl, and it quickly raised over $46,000. Donations and words of support just poured in from all over the country. More than 500 people attended Zara's funeral. It was this powerful testament to how deeply this tragedy had touched people, even those who never knew this little smiling girl. This case stopped being just another crime report. It became, an alarm bell, a reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary and familiar doors. The legal process for Austin Stevens started with a preliminary hearing on October 13th, 2020, less than 2 weeks after his arrest. The point of that stage wasn't to prove guilt, but just to show that the prosecution had enough substantial evidence to send the case to a jury trial. The prosecution presented the court with the digital evidence, the findings from the forensic medical exam, and the testimony of key witnesses, including the paramedics. The judge found the materials they presented more than convincing, and the case was sent to trial. But the full trial didn't even begin until March of 2022. This big delay was because of all the global disruptions in the judicial system from the COVID-19 pandemic, which led to a lot of cases being postponed. When the court hearings finally started, the prosecution team, which included First Assistant District Attorney Edward F. McCann and Assistant District Attorney Brianna Ringwood, they presented their strategy, and it was built on this methodical and just irrefutable presentation of the facts. Central to their argument was the minute-by-minute timeline of events, which they had reconstructed from the data on Stevens' phone. Every single search query, every message sent, every call, it was all tied to a specific time, creating a picture of conscious inaction. This wasn't speculation. It was a mathematically precise reconstruction of the last hours of Zara's life. The prosecution also really focused on his behavioral discrepancies. The paramedics who were first on the scene, the detectives who did the interrogation, and the medical professionals who got Zara at the hospital were all called as witnesses. And they all consistently and calmly described what they saw, the unnatural, cold, emotionless behavior of a father against the backdrop of this tragedy. Their testimony supported the prosecution's main point, that Stevens' actions were not the reaction of a frightened and confused person. After the prosecution was done, the defense took the floor. Their strategy was focused on trying to reframe Stevens' actions. They acknowledged the tragic nature of the situation, but argued that it wasn't the result of a deliberate murder. The defense tried to present his internet searches not as evidence of delay, but as a panicked attempt to find information. And they tried to explain the delay in calling 911 as just confusion and fear and a lack of medical knowledge. But this whole narrative just fell apart when you put it up against the evidence of his parallel, completely calm and flirtatious correspondence. The evidence pointed not to confusion, but to a series of sequential, deliberate decisions. So it wasn't until like 10:40 p.m., which, can you believe it, was over an hour after he'd started those first frantic searches, that Austin Stevens finally picked up the phone and dialed 911. And when he did, he just launched into this whole story, clearly something he'd already made up, and honestly, it turned out to be a complete and utter lie. He tried to claim he was giving Zara a bath, but had just stepped out to the kitchen for a second to grab a beer. And he said that's when he supposedly heard this thud, and he just figured his daughter had hit herself on the tub. Coming back, he said he found her unconscious, pulled her right out, wrapped her in a towel, and then tried to revive her. But when the paramedics burst into that apartment, man, they knew almost instantly that his whole story was just made up. The bathtub was totally dry. I mean, not a single drop of water, no damp towels anywhere, not even the slightest sign that anyone had been bathed in there recently. Zara, she was just dressed in a diaper, lying there on the mattress. But the wildest part for those medics who are, used to seeing parents in a total panic, full of grief in these situations, was just Austin's behavior. He was calm. And not just calm, like a disturbing kind of detached. When one of the paramedics rushing asked him to hand over something from the medical bag, Stevens just kind of shrugged, handed him the wrong thing, didn't even try to fix it. He just stood there watching. And that hour, that crucial hour of delay, an hour where, holy shit, a child's life could have actually been saved, that became the absolute core of the prosecution's case. What was Austin even doing all that time? Why in God's name did he wait? And how, for real, does a person simultaneously Google how to save a baby and then just flirt with women? The answers to those questions, honestly, they ended up painting this portrait of a criminal whose cold-bloodedness just stunned even the most seasoned detectives. At 12 minutes past midnight on October 4th, 2020, at the medical center where Zara had been rushed in such critical condition, the doctors just had no choice but to pronounce her dead. Despite every single effort they made, that little girl couldn't be saved, and from that moment on, the whole thing stopped being just a medical matter. It became a full-blown criminal investigation. Detectives from Montgomery County immediately took over. Austin Stevens' whole story about an accidental fall in the bathtub, that was just completely and definitively blown apart by the medical facts. In parallel, the investigators got a warrant for full access to all the data on Stevens' mobile phone. And what they uncovered there, believe me, it became the irrefutable proof of his guilt, the absolute cornerstone of the prosecution's case. The timestamps from his search queries, cross-referenced with his social media activity, they created this chilling minute-by-minute reconstruction of his actions. It became painfully clear that Stevens hadn't just delayed calling for help. He had made a conscious, deliberate decision not to, choosing instead to spend those precious, fading minutes on his own personal entertainment while his own daughter was literally dying. And then, an analysis of other evidence collected from the apartment, including her diaper, also revealed data that just totally contradicted his testimony. So, after gathering all that overwhelming evidence, on October 6th, 2020, just 2 days after Zara's death, detectives finally arrested Austin Stevens. He was initially charged with aggravated assault and endangering the welfare of a child, and the prosecution immediately pushed to have him held without bail. Then, on December 1st, 2020, the very day Zara would have celebrated her first birthday, can you imagine Montgomery County District Attorney Kevin R. Steele announced that after receiving all the forensic results, the charges had been upgraded. Stevens was now facing first and third-degree murder, along with other related criminal offenses. The news of the arrest and the absolutely horrifying details of the case just rocked the local community. People who knew Stevens as that friendly coach, that respectable businessman, They were just in utter shock. The image he had so carefully built up, it just shattered in an instant, exposing this monstrous reality. One of the most powerful and honestly most telling moments was the public reaction from his own mother. In her statement to the media, she didn't try to make excuses for her son or beg for leniency. Her words, man, they were just full of raw pain and this categorical condemnation. She said he was a monster, that they weren't supporting him at all, that they were 100% against what he did to her granddaughter, and that they loved Zara very, very much. This incredibly clear stance, choosing that murdered child over her own son, was just this rare, profound display of moral clarity in an otherwise grim story. And while the legal machinery was starting to grind, the community actually rallied around Zara's grief-stricken mother, Erica, and her family. A fundraiser was set up on GoFundMe in Zara's memory, and it quickly pulled in over $46,000. Donations and waves of support just poured in from all over the country. More than 500 people actually came to Zara's funeral. It was just this powerful testament to how deeply this tragedy touched people's hearts, even those who never even knew this tiny, smiling girl. This case, it really stopped being just another crime report. It became, a real alarm bell, a stark reminder that evil sometimes can just hide behind the most ordinary, familiar door. The legal process in Austin Stevens' case kicked off with a preliminary hearing on October 13th, 2020, less than 2 weeks after he was arrested. The whole point of that stage isn't to prove guilt, but just to show that the prosecution had enough solid evidence to send the case to a jury trial. The prosecution laid out all the digital evidence for the court, the forensic medical examination findings, and the testimony from key witnesses, including the paramedics. The judge found what they presented more than convincing, and so the case was indeed sent to trial. But, believe it or not, the full trial itself didn't even start until March of 2022. This significant delay, was caused by all those global disruptions in the judicial system because of the COVID-19 pandemic, which just pushed back so many cases. When the court hearings finally began, the prosecution team, which included First Assistant District Attorney Edward F. McCann and Assistant District Attorney Brianna Ringwood, they presented their strategy, and it was just built on this really methodical, undeniable presentation of the facts. Central to their argument was that minute-by-minute timeline of events, totally reconstructed from the data on Stevens' phone. Every single search query, every message sent, every phone call was pinpointed to a specific time, creating this absolutely damning picture of conscious inaction. This wasn't some kind of speculation, it was a mathematically precise reconstruction of Zara's last hours. The prosecution also heavily emphasized the behavioral discrepancies. The paramedics who were first on the scene, the detectives who conducted the interrogation, and the medical professionals who received Zara at the hospital, they were all called as witnesses. And they all, every single one of them, consistently and calmly described what they saw, the utterly unnatural, cold, emotionless behavior of a father against the backdrop of an unfolding tragedy. Their testimony just solidified the prosecution's main point that Stevens' actions were absolutely not the reaction of a frightened and confused person. After the prosecution presented all its evidence, the defense took their turn. And their strategy just revolved around trying to reframe Stevens' actions. They acknowledged the tragic situation, sure, but they argued that it wasn't the result of a deliberate murder. The defense tried to spin his internet searches, not as evidence of delay, but as a panicked attempt to find information. And they explained the delay in calling 911 as just confusion, fear, and a general lack of medical knowledge. However, that narrative just utterly fell apart when it was put up against the evidence of his parallel, completely calm and flirtatious correspondence. The evidence really pointed not to confusion at all, but to a series of sequential, deliberate decisions. The central theme running through this whole tragedy, it's just this idea of invisible risk. I mean, in a world where so many agreements we make, even like child custody, are built on this totally informal foundation, we rely on intuitive trust. We trust because a person seems normal, because they have a good reputation, because I guess it's just easier, it's more convenient. But the Stevens case, man, it showed with just brutal clarity how incredibly fragile and deceptive that whole system can be. The complete absence of formal frameworks or like any external oversight and documentation, it just creates these blind spots where the most horrific things can happen and just thrive totally unnoticed. This case, for real, it forces you to think about the psychology of trust and deception. Austin Stevens was a master of camouflage. His public persona, this successful, responsible, and charming guy, it wasn't just a mask, it was a carefully constructed fortress that protected this dark inner essence. And it raises this really disturbing question: how well do we really know the people we let into our lives, the people we entrust with our most precious thing? This story just drives home that evil doesn't always have an ugly face. A lot of the time, it looks respectable and says all the right things. The most dangerous predators are the ones who have just perfectly mastered the art of mimicking normalcy. And Jesus Christ, digital technology played such a key role in solving this crime. Austin Stevens' phone basically became the black box of this entire disaster. Without the data they pulled from it, proving his intent, and that cold-blooded delay would have been so much harder, like immeasurably difficult. His search queries, his correspondence, it became this absolutely irrefutable window right into his consciousness in those critical moments. So this case, it's just a vivid example of how in the modern world of criminology, a digital trail can end up telling you more than any witness ever could. It documented not just his actions, but his intentions, turning subjective assumptions into objective, undeniable facts. So, what are the practical lessons we can actually take from this tragedy? There's a few, and they go way beyond this one specific case. Structure is more important than assumptions. Any agreements that have to do with a child's well-being have to be as clear as possible. And if you can documented, this isn't about not trusting someone. It's about building a safety system that works independently of personal relationships. Observation is a form of care, you know? Trust shouldn't stop you from paying attention. It's so important to notice the little changes in behavior in people who you've entrusted with your kids. Being distant, uncharacteristic, irritability, evasive answers to simple questions, all of that stuff might not just be a sign of a bad mood, it can be a signal of deeper problems. Listen to nonverbal cues. Kids, especially young ones, they can't always put their discomfort into words. Their behavior, fear, a reluctance to go to someone, a change in their mood after a visit that might be their only way of telling you that something is wrong, and ignoring those signals, that's just not an option. And finally, the case of Zara Scruggs just forces us to think about the very nature of justice. A life sentence for Austin Stevens is an act of legal retribution, and, it isolates a dangerous criminal from society, its accountability. But does it bring any real healing? Does it bring Zara back? The answer, it's obvious. True justice in her memory isn't just about punishing the guilty, it's about the lessons that we as a society have to learn from her death. If this story makes even one family more vigilant, if it helps prevent just one similar tragedy, then her short life, it won't have been in vain. Zara's legacy is a call to action, a call to responsibility and to that constant, unwavering attention that is honestly the highest form of love and protection. Zara Scruggs' name became more than just a headline in some crime story. It became this reminder that evil, it doesn't always come with, obvious warning signs. Sometimes it just has the most familiar face. It reminds us that silence, especially when something inside you is telling you that not all is right, can have a price that's just unimaginably high. The legacy left behind by this little girl, it's a call for prevention. A call for vigilance in everyday life, for responsibility even within the family, and for protecting children not just with love, but with attention, boundaries, and a readiness to act before the only thing you have left is just a bitter hindsight. The story of Zara isn't just about what happened in one apartment on one terrible night. It's a story about how what seemed ordinary on the outside was hiding decisions on the inside that changed absolutely everything.